third of the building has been blown away.
Never before had Americans seen such an atrocity on their own soil. A bombing in the heartland destroyed 16 blocks of downtown Oklahoma City. Over 800 were injured in the blast, and 168 men, women, and children were killed. It was an explosion that shook a nation. Even more disturbing, the accused mastermind was a decorated American veteran. With his extremist beliefs and violent defiance, Timothy McVeigh was notorious. April 18th, 1995. Timothy McVeigh and his accomplice, Terry Nichols, drove their rental car to a secluded portion of Geary Lake State Park in Junction City, Kansas. Loaded in the car were all the materials the two would need. McVeigh had practiced assembling the bomb for months. It was finally time. Everything had to go perfectly. In less than 3 hours, McVeigh built a 5,000-pound massive bomb that would rewrite American history.
Timothy McVeigh was a man hell-bent on destruction.
He was finally about to regain the control that he believed the government had taken from him.
On the morning of April 19th, 1995, Timothy McVeigh got behind the wheel of his rental truck, loaded with a 5,000-pound homemade bomb. The bomb could easily blow if McVeigh got into the slightest fender bender. After 4 hours, McVeigh arrived in Oklahoma City and began driving toward his final destination.
At 9 a.m., McVeigh parked his rental truck in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building.
The Murrah Building was home to 550 federal agents, including members of the Secret Service, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. As agents arrived to work that morning, an oversized yellow truck pulled into the building's drop-off zone.
At 9 a.m., McVeigh went to the back of the truck, lit a fuse, and walked away.
At 9:02 a.m., a massive 5,000-pound explosive tore through all 15 floors of the Murrah Building.
Holy cow. About a third of the building has been blown away.
It was a catastrophe unlike any the country had seen before.
The magnitude of this attack was unprecedented. This was the most significant attack on American soil by an American terrorist up to this point. Other terrorists had come from American soil, but McVeigh knew his actions would cause mass amounts of bloodshed and huge numbers of people to die.
Timothy McVeigh had struck a blow at the American heartland. Willetta Heath was at work across town when the bomb went off. Her husband Paul worked in the Murrah Building.
We pulled the TV out, turned it on, and when I saw it, I realized it was his building. But I could tell the floor didn't fall away where his office was. So if he was in the office, then he was okay.
When the explosion happened, the floor collapsed about 10 feet in front of me. There were people that were hurt. We started trying to figure out where everyone was to see who was injured and who wasn't. I knew immediately that we were going to have casualties because of the way the building collapsed.
168 people died in this explosion, and 684 others were injured.
The number of casualties was shocking, but not all the victims were workers.
Within the Murrah Building, there was a daycare where several children were killed.
There were mothers who were there crying and upset because their children, some of them were killed. That really was very hurtful to me, to think someone could do this thing to children. The gravity of the It was unbelievable.
As predicted, the death toll rose sharply overnight, and the rescue workers had the extra psychological burden of expecting to find dead bodies rather than survivors.
The media really covered it so thoroughly. You actually reached a point after a while where you couldn't watch it all the time. It was so disturbing.
And the nature of what they've been finding will make identification a long, distressing process.
We knew it was some kind of a terrorist attack. Exactly what kind, no one knew. Several of my fellow FBI profiler colleagues were then sent out to Oklahoma City to assist in the investigation. It was their role to find out not just what happened, but why and what kind of individual would do this.
The problem with this kind of horrific explosion is that there's really very little left. Essentially, everything is fragmented. So you have a bomb that's sitting someplace at the bottom of the building, everything comes down on top of it. When that building came down, there's virtually no evidence left for investigators to work with from the scene.
Investigators sifted through rubble for 2 grueling days and found no clues. On the morning of April 20th, investigators made their first break in the case.
FBI agents discovered a vehicle identification number on a rear axle found in the wreckage.
Police tracked the vehicle back to a rental company in Junction City, Kansas. Records show the truck was rented, but never returned. The name on the rental was Robert Kling.
FBI agents then worked with the rental company employees to create a sketch of the man who rented the truck.
The sketch aired on nearly every TV network in the nation. Within hours, a local motel owner came forward and said the man had checked into her motel on the evening of April 17th. The name on the guest log wasn't Robert Kling, it was Timothy McVeigh. Agents now had a suspect. Their next challenge would be finding him. But 215 miles south of Junction City, investigators caught yet another big break in the case. McVeigh was already in custody. He'd been arrested near Perry, Oklahoma, 90 minutes after the bombing.
McVeigh was stopped on I-35 for driving without a license plate. He admitted to Officer Charles Hanger, who pulled him over, that he was carrying a concealed firearm. On one of the deadliest days in U.S. history, certainly to this date, McVeigh was arrested for driving without license plates and for illegal firearm possession. Officer Charles Hanger did what every officer dreams of doing, making that one car stop, that one arrest, that in fact helped solve a case.
On April 21st, investigators visited McVeigh in his holding cell. The evidence against him began mounting. They found traces of chemicals used in the bombing on McVeigh's clothing. They found a business card on which McVeigh had scribbled TNT at $5 a stick, need more. And they discovered an address, scribbled on the back of another business card. The address belonged to McVeigh's friend, a man named Terry Nichols.
Nichols learned that federal agents were suspicious of him and were looking to question him. He knew that his capture was inevitable.
He came into the station at approximately 2:30 today. He identified himself as Terry Lynn Nichols.
He felt that probably the best chance he had of avoiding the death penalty was to turn himself in and look like he was cooperating.
2 days after the blast, Terry Nichols turned himself in to federal agents. While McVeigh wouldn't talk to the authorities, Terry Nichols did. In his interrogation, Nichols blamed the bombing on McVeigh and tried to distance himself from the crime. But a search of his home turned up incriminating evidence.
The FBI found all kinds of blasting caps, ground ammonium nitrate, and a hand-drawn map of the downtown area of Oklahoma City. They also found receipts with McVeigh's fingerprints on them.
McVeigh was additionally indicted on 11 federal charges.
A federal grand jury indicted both McVeigh and Nichols on murder and conspiracy charges. The 11-count indictment listed all 168 victims, from 73-year-old Charles Hurlburt to 4-month-old Gabriel Bruce. With the indictment, McVeigh and Nichols became two of the most notorious domestic terrorists in American history. Americans had been stunned by the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 that killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000. But that attack had been carried out by international terrorists. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were completely homegrown.
Emotionally, this was different for Americans. We'd had the World Trade Center bombing that happened 2 years earlier, but that was international terrorism. This was an American who had plotted to kill other Americans.
Domestic terrorism, and especially of this nature, was not something we were used to.
Not only was there a catastrophic bombing on U.S. soil, it was the first major act of domestic terrorism to result in mass casualties.
This was really confusing for Americans. So we were all struggling with the question of why would somebody do this?
The nation was in mourning and in shock. How could this have happened? How could a 26-year-old decorated Army veteran commit such an act? And what drove him to such an extreme? In one of the most horrific acts of terror ever visited on American soil, a decorated American veteran named Timothy McVeigh conspired with associates to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma City. Using a rental truck with a 5,000-pound homemade explosive device inside, McVeigh killed 168 men, women, and children, and destroyed countless more lives. He and his accomplice were now in custody. Authorities searched for a motive. Dozens of books and films have attempted to answer the same question. What drove the 26-year-old veteran to turn on his own government and commit an act so horrific it would transform him into one of the most notorious terrorists of all time? To many, the answers laid in McVeigh's past. During the 1970s, Pendleton, New York was much like any other working-class town. Residents worked blue-collar jobs and enjoyed an outdoor lifestyle of hunting and fishing. At Pendleton High School, a lanky, quiet student struggled to find his place.
McVeigh was tormented and bullied as a child. Most people are bullied. I can't think of anybody, and the statistics would indicate this too. Most people have experienced bullying in their lives. Most people don't bomb a federal building and kill almost 200 people. The flip side of that statistic is that most people who are mass murderers are in some way bullied.
Looking back at the early years of someone's life, when they're the ones being bullied, all kinds of issues can develop. Persecution, paranoia. Sometimes those people can turn to violent acts themselves or criminal activity.
Just before his 11th birthday, McVeigh's mother divorced his father and left Pendleton to find a better life, taking Timothy's 2 sisters with her, but leaving him behind.
After his parents divorced, McVeigh found it hard to have a healthy relationship with them. Even though he lived with his father, he was closest with his grandfather.
McVeigh's only friend was his grandfather, and what they did was spend a lot of time hunting. So I think that played a large part in his fascination with firearms.
He cherished the time that he spent with his grandfather and took everything he learned from him to heart.
McVeigh learned about guns, Second Amendment rights, things like that from his grandfather. And I think for people like McVeigh, firearms become, in many cases, the center of their life. They view the Constitution as only the Second Amendment. They view the number of guns that they own and really the number of bullets that they own as critically important to their self-identity. McVeigh read magazines that some people might view as fringe magazines. For example, the Turner Diaries, which is pretty much a right-wing publication that people like McVeigh view as sort of a Bible.
The Turner Diaries tell the story of a small group of anti-government militia recruits who blow up FBI headquarters. The act is presented as heroic, but many critics consider the book to be the very definition of hate speech and far-right propaganda. But to young, misguided Timothy McVeigh, these men were standing up to bullies. In this case, the U.S. government.
At college, McVeigh quickly found that he was dissatisfied with what he was doing. So after 2 years, he gave up on earning a college degree. He dropped out and enlisted in the Army.
His fascination with firearms is something that he carried with him throughout his teenage years, so it's not surprising that he enrolled in the Army in 1988 at the age of 20.
Arms! 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1!
McVeigh decided to go into the Army, and that structure allowed him to do the thing that he really wanted to do more than anything else, and that was professionally shoot guns.
Order! Arms!
In the U.S. Army, he was able to practice the skills he learned from his grandfather, and people respected him for how good he was. He was an excellent shooter and a dedicated soldier.
Surrounded by the things he loved and people who shared similar passions, McVeigh finally fit in. He was finally able to connect with people around him, and his talents brought him some popularity.
His skills caught the attention of his fellow soldiers, Michael Fortier and Terry Nichols, and the three became close friends during basic training.
McVeigh was deployed in Operation Desert Storm. His prior skills, combined with refining his techniques during basic training, made him deadly on the battlefield.
In a little over a month, the war was over. The U.S. and coalition forces crushed an underarmed and underprepared Iraqi army. American forces suffered fewer than 300 losses, while over 25,000 Iraqis were killed. McVeigh was awarded numerous medals, but the experience was not what he'd expected.
After earning so many honors, McVeigh hoped he would be able to join the U.S. Army Special Forces. He felt that after doing so well in his first deployment, moving on to the Special Forces was the next step forward.
Part of admission into Special Forces includes the psychological evaluation, which McVeigh failed. McVeigh was very, very disappointed when he didn't make Special Forces, and I think McVeigh also felt very angry.
McVeigh was honorably discharged and returned home to Western New York.
McVeigh, like a lot of veterans, struggled to find his place in a civilian world. In the Army, everything is clear, your mission, your rank, but when you get into the civilian world, things aren't clear, things get muddy.
He was doing important stuff in the Army. People respected him in the Army, but now he's back in the same town that caused him problems before, working at jobs that he just felt were beneath him.
With each new job and failure to find a place where he felt like he belonged, McVeigh became increasingly transient and angry, especially towards the government.
He seemed to have developed a resentment toward anybody or anything that had power or authority.
Soon, a national news story would fuel McVeigh's growing anger at the government. Federal agents had begun a crackdown on illegal guns that would lead to one of the bloodiest standoffs in FBI history. Growing up surrounded by guns, Timothy McVeigh greatly valued his ability to defend himself and had grown increasingly paranoid that the government could try and take away his defenses. His anti-government ideology would only grow stronger in the coming months. On August 21st, 1992, federal agents surrounded the cabin of Randy Weaver in Ruby Ridge, Idaho. Weaver was suspected of selling illegal firearms. As ATF agents prepared to raid the Weaver cabin, gunshots rang out. The agents were forced to kill the family's dog when it discovered them on their property. Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, returned fire. When the dust settled, Sammy Weaver was dead. So was one of the federal agents. The next day, the FBI joined with ATF agents and fired on the Weaver cabin again, this time killing Weaver's wife, Vicky, who was unarmed.
McVeigh watched on, and he was really horrified and repulsed. that the government had resorted to using such destructive tactics on their own citizens.
After an 11-day standoff, Randy Weaver surrendered and was taken into custody. For pro-gun advocates, Ruby Ridge became a rallying cry, and the feds became the enemy. For Timothy McVeigh, government actions in Ruby Ridge marked a turning point.
To McVeigh, Ruby Ridge justified his ideas, and it really just fueled him to act.
He saw this as a deep betrayal, and his true enemy from there on was the United States government.
There were definitely elements of paranoia on the part of McVeigh during this time frame, and the Waco situation certainly didn't help.
Reinforcements are pouring in. Hundreds of armed federal officers now surround the compound. Armored personnel carriers here to protect them against the machine guns used by the religious sect. Inside today, the cult members hoisted a flag, a version of the Star of David meant to refer to their leader, David Koresh.
David Koresh was the leader of a religious group, the Branch Davidians. Their compound in Waco, Texas, held over 100 members, including 18 children. Federal agents suspected Koresh of stockpiling illegal assault weapons.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had been monitoring the Davidians for some time, but decided to pursue legal action when they had reason to believe they were acquiring illegal weapons.
The cult members breaking their promise to surrender. Armored personnel carriers moving closer to the compound.
The ATF raided the compound in late February of 1993. 4 agents were killed and numerous other ones were injured. And thus began a 51-day standoff.
Timothy McVeigh wanted to make a statement because he actually got into a car and drove to Waco. He was there to observe the siege. He wanted to protest what he thought was the oppression of the federal government as he had seen it manifest in Waco and Ruby Ridge.
In Waco, McVeigh passed out pro-gun literature and copies of the Turner Diaries for several days.
He hoped that by passing out pro-gun literature and leaflets that were promoting anti-government ideas, he would be able to change minds and help protect the right to bear arms.
McVeigh caught the attention of a local reporter. In an interview, he railed against the federal agents who were on the scene, claiming they had no authority to do what they were doing.
McVeigh saw the government's reaction to the Branch Davidians as an act of oppression and forcibly taking away their Second Amendment rights.
McVeigh left Waco before the end of the siege and made his way to a Michigan farm owned by his old Army buddy, Terry Nichols. It was there, on April 19, 1993, that McVeigh and Nichols watched together as federal agents ended the standoff in Waco. They used tanks to bulldoze the compound. Authorities believe the members of the religious group used an incendiary fuel to set the compound on fire from the inside, to disastrous results. The compound was quickly engulfed by fire, whipped up by the Texas winds.
It was very disconcerting to watch a building on fire and then several buildings on fire, knowing that people were trapped alive inside there. It was a tragic end to a situation that never should have gotten as far as it ever did.
And before it was over, 80 people were dead, 27 of them were children. I don't think had that many Americans been killed by their fellow Americans in one activity. And a lot of people, including innocent children, died in that, and that was performed by the federal government.
The FBI simply ran out of patience, opted for tanks and tear gas against many innocent women and children, and have been found wholly blameless.
The shooting at Ruby Ridge and the deadly end to the Waco standoff were two of the darkest chapters in the history of federal law enforcement. While McVeigh held the government accountable, government officials told a different story.
These people killed 4 federal officials in the line of duty. They were heavily armed. They fired on federal officials yesterday repeatedly, and they were never fired back on. We did everything we could to avoid the loss of life. They made the decision to immolate themselves.
After Waco, McVeigh was angry and afraid that the government could come after him.
Now all of a sudden he took those feelings of persecution and paranoia and felt he had to be the one to do something about it. He had to take matters into his own hands. He had to kill people.
As McVeigh's anger and paranoia increased, he enlisted the help of Terry Nichols.
McVeigh reconnected with Terry Nichols and I think formed an unusual bond. They went out to the farm that Terry Nichols owned, and they improvised weapons, they tested weapons, they were basically practicing how bombs were going to work and sort of gradually perfecting how to make them.
Over the next 17 months, McVeigh and Nichols practiced building a massive bomb that they planned to use to send a message to the federal government.
Terry Nichols actually taught Timothy McVeigh how to improvise bombs out of household chemicals, goods you'd find just laying around your house, and they perfected those techniques on the farm far away from prying eyes.
They stole blasting gel and caps and the ignition cord from a nearby quarry. At farming feed stores, they purchased huge amounts of ammonium nitrate and nitromethane, a combination used to build fertilizer bombs and capable of causing enormous damage.
Individuals with like-minded beliefs living together can sometimes produce echo chambers of nothing but the same thoughts and ideas being bounced back and forth with no one to filter them or even contradict them at times. If the talk's about a violent overthrow of a government, the evils of the society in which they live, and how they want to do their best to change things, even if it takes violence, that's when matters can be taken to the next level, and that's when people can die.
Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
In September of 1994, less than 18 months after the disaster at Waco, President Clinton signed the 1994 crime bill banning assault weapons. To Timothy McVeigh, this was a violation of his Second Amendment rights. His greatest fears were being realized.
McVeigh saw this as a direct threat to his livelihood. If he couldn't own certain weapons, then he couldn't properly defend himself if needed. This was unacceptable to him, and the government had to be held accountable for putting people's lives in danger. If they waited too long, their planning and preparation may have all been for nothing. They needed to act quickly before they weren't allowed to take any action at all.
1 month after the assault rifle ban, McVeigh purchased 3 54-gallon drums of nitromethane. It was the last ingredient he and Nichols would need to build their massive bomb.
If the government had used extreme measures to take away citizens' freedoms, he would have to use extreme measures to show them they were wrong.
To help with the final preparations, McVeigh and Nichols recruited Army friend Michael Fortier. Together, the three decided on a target, the Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City.
Timothy McVeigh believed that federal power was oppressing us, and the Murrah Federal Building was a place of federal power. And the idea was that the Murrah Federal Building would be media-friendly for coverage. That was the manifestation of exactly what Timothy McVeigh had planned. He wanted people to pay attention to this and to see it, and that's exactly what the media provided.
The attack was planned for April 19th, 1995, 7 months after the assault weapon ban, and exactly 2 years after the fiery destruction of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco. On April 17th, McVeigh rented a yellow moving van that he would use to transport his homemade bomb to Oklahoma City and rewrite American history. Growing up in rural New York, Timothy McVeigh loved guns. After enlisting in the U.S. Army, he saw action in the Gulf War, distinguishing himself in combat. When he was discharged from the Army and unable to hold a job, he became increasingly angry with what he saw as U.S. government overreach into the lives of gun-owning citizens.
To roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country.
Radicalized by the 1992 standoff at Ruby Ridge and the 1993 attack by federal agents on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, McVeigh plotted to commit an act of terror against the U.S. government. He constructed a 5,000-pound bomb and chose a strategic target, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City.
He wanted people to pay attention to this and to see it.
The ensuing explosion killed 168 people and made Timothy McVeigh the most notorious domestic terrorist in American history. McVeigh's heinous act has inspired more than a dozen books, films, and countless speculation. Was McVeigh a cold-blooded killer, a misguided patriot, or both? On the morning of April 19th, 1995, Timothy McVeigh parked an oversized rental truck in the loading zone of the Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. In the truck were 2 tons of ammonium nitrate and 162 gallons of nitromethane forged into a 5,000-pound fertilizer bomb that would change America forever.
Holy cow. About a third of the building has been blown away.
An exhaustive manhunt ensued, and soon authorities had a face and a name: Timothy McVeigh. 3 days after the bombing, investigators discovered their suspect was already in custody. He'd been arrested after a routine traffic stop for illegal firearm possession. Sitting in county jail, he was charged with 11 felony counts. Timothy McVeigh became a household name, and the nation watched intently as McVeigh and his co-conspirators awaited trial.
McVeigh's lawyers knew that he had no chance of finding an unbiased jury in any Oklahoma court.
It would seem to be almost impossible to find anybody in the country who didn't hate McVeigh for the crime he committed.
The trial was moved from Oklahoma City to Denver. In the lead-up to the trial, McVeigh clashed with his lawyers about his defense strategy. He freely admitted to carrying out the bombing, but claimed it was necessary in response to the dangerous tyranny of the government.
McVeigh believed that he was justified in what he did. What he wanted to do is to demonstrate his political distorted beliefs were somehow helpful to the majority of the American people, and everybody would be better off in the future for it.
On April 24th, 1997, 2 years after the bombing, the eyes of the world were on Denver for the start of McVeigh's trial in federal court.
We had a closed-circuit television feed from Denver. The people here in Oklahoma City could actually watch the trial.
In a dramatic opening argument, prosecutors recalled the catastrophic destruction of the bombing. They painted McVeigh as an American terrorist whose twisted sense of patriotism drove him to kill 168 people. The bombing, the state said, was McVeigh's political statement.
Timothy McVeigh put himself at the forefront of this anti-U.S. government militia movement. He saw himself as the poster child for his belief system, his philosophy, his ideology.
The prosecution heard testimony from 137 individuals, many of them victims or relatives of those who died in the blast. The most emotional testimony concerned the deaths of 15 children and babies who were in the building's daycare center.
McVeigh knew that we had a daycare center, and actually they parked the truck where many of the children from the daycare center was in their little beds.
4 infants who were in cribs right next to the window were among the 15 children who died.
Hearing the testimony of the victims would have caused anybody to break down in tears, especially the testimony that you hear from the people who lost their innocent babies. But to McVeigh, he just took it as a price that had to be paid.
It's kind of hard to get your mind around somebody that would deliberately hurt, injure, and create all kinds of chaos in people's lives.
During the testimonies, onlookers studied McVeigh for a reaction.
He was very nonchalant, a very look what I've accomplished kind of attitude. I felt like he was very angry underneath.
He looked vacant at best, or annoyed by having to sit through the testimony. So when we look at him and he just has zero reaction to killing babies, 19 babies, he's just not emotionally reactive. He does not connect to humans and emotions.
He would never give anybody the satisfaction of showing that he felt bad for what he did. He knew what pain it caused, but McVeigh didn't care.
The state's star witness was McVeigh's accomplice, Michael Fortier. As part of a plea deal, Fortier told the jury that McVeigh wanted to create a revolution and revealed almost every detail of the plot and execution. After a 6-week trial, the case went to the jury, and soon an anxious nation would hear their verdict.
We, the jury, find as follows in the case of Timothy McVeigh. Count one.
May 31st, 1997, Denver, Colorado. After a 6-week trial in federal court, the Oklahoma City bombing case against the now notorious Timothy McVeigh went to the jury.
They stood on the streets of Oklahoma City waiting for news, anxiety etched on every face.
We, the jury, find as follows in the case of Timothy McVeigh. Count one. Conspiracy, guilty.
They were not surprised, for the evidence against McVeigh had been overwhelming. They were simply overcome with relief that the man responsible for so many tears had been duly convicted.
The families all felt some relief. So many people knew either someone in the building that died or was injured. You know, it touched so many lives.
They were satisfied that justice had been done, but none of it could bring back those they had lost.
Some consolation, not much of it. Satisfaction, but there's no relief at all. Sorry.
McVeigh was found guilty on all counts. The jury was tasked with handing down a sentence. The prosecution pressed for the death penalty.
Many more will not be satisfied unless the penalty is death. That will require a new hearing in front of the same jury starting on Wednesday.
McVeigh's lawyer asked for a life sentence, arguing that McVeigh was not driven by an evil hatred for his victims, but rather a deep commitment to defending citizens' rights. The jury came back with a decision in 2 days.
On June 2nd, 1997, the jury recommended the death penalty.
When the verdict was read, McVeigh showed no reaction.
I definitely feel like he got what he deserved, and I'm not really a big one for the death penalty. I just feel like McVeigh was one of those that was so evil that he deserved what he got.
After sentencing, McVeigh was taken to the Supermax Federal Prison in Florence, Colorado, where he joined 2 other notorious terrorists. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, serving 4 life sentences for his bombings, and Ramzi Youssef, serving a 240-year sentence for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. While McVeigh considered an appeal, his alleged co-conspirator, Terry Nichols, went on trial. The jury found Nichols guilty.
Nichols' jury was deadlocked on whether or not he would receive the death sentence. By legal statute, he then received life in prison.
Co-conspirator Michael Fortier was deemed to have played a minimal role in the attack, but was found guilty of failing to notify authorities of the bombing. He received a 12-year prison sentence. In the summer of 1999, McVeigh was transferred to the nation's only federal death row in Indiana.
He knew any appeal was completely hopeless. He could have strung the whole thing out for another 10 years or so, but I don't think he wanted to. I don't think he wanted to live in prison in the conditions that he was in. He just wanted to end it.
McVeigh stated that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison.
Even at the end, McVeigh was unrepentant, repeating his claim that he did what he did to fight what he called an oppressive government.
Even when McVeigh was in prison and just before being executed, he continued to hold on to his belief that he was right, that he was justified. As he said, sorry that these people had to lose their lives, but that's the nature of the beast.
His only regret was not completely leveling the federal building.
6 years after the Oklahoma City bombing, and 4 years after his conviction, hundreds of demonstrators, both for and against the death penalty, gathered outside the federal prison in Indiana.
Execution Day was a really strange media event. There was a real media vigil. This was covered live. We just saw the outside of where it was happening.
On June 11, 2001, McVeigh requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream as a last meal. The execution would be witnessed by 10 journalists, McVeigh's lawyers, and another 232 people in Oklahoma City, linked by satellite feed.
At 7 a.m., McVeigh was led into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney.
Some people wanted to see McVeigh die, and so they did bring it to Oklahoma City through the feed.
While the idea of watching an execution seems harsh, it makes sense because Americans needed closure.
In the minutes before he died, he appeared to have done everything possible to demonstrate his control over events, including a curt nod to each of the media witnesses. He had no last words.
Instead, McVeigh left behind the poem Invictus to speak for him. The poem ends with the words, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul."
Timothy McVeigh continues to be an icon of the extreme right, neo-Nazis. They view him as an anti-government crusader who really put everything on the line to show his utter distrust of the federal government.
Right-wing groups and extremists have heralded him as a revolutionary. Extremists have used McVeigh as a role model and a source of inspiration for how to wreak their own havoc.
What was left of the Murrah building was demolished. The Oklahoma City National Memorial was built in its place. The outdoor memorial includes 168 glass chairs, one for each victim.
Oklahoma kind of had a coming together, and that just kind of outshined the evilness that happened. Our governor at the time labeled it the Oklahoma Standard because the coming together and helping people during this difficult time was the Oklahoma people. That was our spirit.
That standard serves as a beacon, a hope that extreme violence will always be met by an affirmation of our shared humanity.